We got a special guest here tonight, and we have Mitzi Williams. And this is an MS Views Now program, and it is about what's happening with MS Views now, as it's going on, all right? We are sponsored tonight by Genentech, so let's thank Genentech virtually. Yay, I know you're all clapping for them, right? We're going to begin. Dr. Williams, take it away.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Hi, everybody. Happy Thursday. I'm Mitzi Williams. I'm a neurologist, MS doctor in Atlanta, Georgia, rainy Atlanta. And we're going to talk a little bit about clinical trials. So this is a cool topic that I like to talk about quite often. And we're going to just kind of take a step back and talk about what is clinical research, what's the purpose of it, why do we want people to get involved, and what groups we need more involved in clinical research. So let's get the party started. All right. So what are clinical trials? So clinical trials are certain studies where people volunteer to help us scientists answer specific questions about health in different conditions. They are conducted according to what we call a protocol, which is a very, very long document where lots of researchers and others sit down and try to come up with what we call the criteria for those people who are able to participate or should participate, the schedule of the different types of visits, whether there are tests that need to be done like MRIs, procedures like lumbar punctures, and if those need to be repeated at certain time points. Also, they decide the protocol talks about the different medicines that may be involved. You know, with many of our older clinical trials, they focused on, medicines, and then they were compared to what we call placebo, which is no medicine. But now that we have many effective therapies, over 20 effective therapies for multiple sclerosis, most of our newer trials are compared to other medications that are already on the market, because we want everybody with MS to be treated with something, because we know that treatment often makes a difference. The protocol also talks about the length of the study. Most of our clinical trials either are 1 year or 2 years, and many of them have the opportunity for people to continue in that trial for several other years and be monitored over time. And then most importantly, what we hope to learn from the study, right? So we don't just do experiments just to experiment on people. We have to have a valid scientific question, and these questions are monitored by different agencies to make sure that they're valid and that it would be a good research study that conducts good science. So people agree to participate in the studies, and so there is a consent form that's attached to that protocol, and the consent form outlines kind of what the purpose of the study is, what you're agreeing to. Again, the professionals that create the protocol usually include different researchers as well as experts within that field. So for MS, I've had the opportunity to help create some research protocols along with many of my colleagues. And one thing that I'm very excited about is that now protocols are pushing, many of us in the scientific community are pushing to have people who are living with MS be a part of that protocol creation process, because obviously you're the ones that are being affected. So we can't create the research effectively without including the patient voice in that. And so that's something that's relatively new that I hope will catch on and become a regular part of clinical trial creation. And then of course the rules and then there are rules to make sure that people who are participating are safe and treated as safely as possible. So safety is the primary issue with many clinical trials. And so if these are done correctly, they're the safest and fastest way to help bring new treatments to the market and to also improve overall health. So why are clinical trials done? I think we talked a little bit about this, but they're conducted for many different reasons, right? So certainly with the field of MS, it's been a very exciting time in the field of MS because we have almost a new treatment nearly every year, or at least every other year. Sometimes we have 2 or 3 treatments that come out in the same year, right? So one of the major reasons why trials are conducted is to make sure that a drug is safe and that it's effective for people who live with different conditions like multiple sclerosis. There are also trials that are done for different devices. We don't see that as much with MS, but more in other specialties, like for instance, people with heart disease may need certain procedures done like stents or pacemakers, things like that. Also, clinical trials can be done to look at medications that are approved to see if they work for other disease states, right? So one of the things we often find is that, let's say there's a drug that's used for rheumatoid arthritis that may be good for MS and vice versa. And so they have to do specific studies, even if a drug is approved, in that condition to make sure that it works for that new condition. Also, it helps us to learn how to safely use medications in populations that maybe weren't included in the clinical trial. We'll talk a little bit about groups that are not included in many of our clinical trials, but for instance, pediatric populations, right? So again, you can't just take a drug and say, now we're going to use it in everybody for this condition. We have to do studies to help us to understand, how these drugs may affect different populations. So before we get into the phases of clinical research, though, I also want to say that there are other ways to be involved in research. So clinical trials are kind of the most regimented research studies, but there are many, many other ways for people to get involved. There may be registries, right? Questionnaires. There are many studies that look at interventions like diet, exercise, mindfulness, meditation, all of those things. So all of those studies are also created with protocols that have to be approved, but they're not quite as strict as our clinical trials. But those are also valid ways to get involved in research. All right, so let's talk about phases of clinical trials. The phase where most people get involved is phase 3, okay? But there are a couple of other phases that happen before the large studies that we're used to hearing about at our medical meetings and that often lead to the approval of medications. So phase 1 is a small number of people, like 25 to 50. And the goal of phase 1 studies is to take a new treatment or compound and to really make sure that it's being delivered the right way, right? Should it be delivered as a pill? Should it be an injection? Should it be an IV medication? It helps us to find the right dose to make sure that a person is getting a safe amount that's also effective, the most effective, safest amount. And then also looking at side effects, right? So safety and side effects are looked at throughout the whole clinical research process. Phase 2 looks at a slightly larger number of people, so like 100 to 300. And the goal of these types of trials is, again, to look at effectiveness to make sure it's the right dose, and also to look at safety, right? We're looking at side effects. Sometimes you may not see side effects in a small number of people, but once you get a larger number of people on some type of medication or therapy or using some type of device, you'll see more of the side effects. And then there's phase 3. So phase 3 trials are the big trials that lead to approval of our medications. And most of our MS therapies have at least 2 phase 3 trials, right? So you can't just do one study and say we're good. You have to do at least 2 of these large clinical trials. Sometimes the way they're set up is very similar. Sometimes the way they're set up is slightly different, but you got to have at least 2 separate groups of folks where the medication is effective. And then it also helps us to collect more information about side effects. And these trials typically have about 1,000 to 3,000 people who are involved in them. And usually these are the ones where the medication is compared to another medication on the market. And then finally, there are phase 4 trials. So these are trials that are done after a medication is approved. And these trials are often looking at maybe populations that weren't included in the original trials, like pediatric populations, or in some cases, underserved populations. But they also can give us more information about safety, side effects, best way to administer medications. But particularly phase 3 are the ones that lead to approval, and you got to have 2 phase 3 studies with somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 people showing that the drug is effective for it to get approved. So let's talk a little bit about the role of different members of the research team, right? So if you go see a neurologist and your neurologist conducts research, these are some of the terms that are used in research. So the principal investigator is the doctor who's in charge, so to speak. So for instance, at my practice, I would be the principal investigator for any studies that are conducted. A sub-investigator is usually another doctor or medical staff person who helps assist with certain parts of the study, like exams and things like that. I have been a sub-I. I have been a sub-investigator at some of my previous practices. And then you also usually have a research coordinator, and that's a person who, communicates with the individuals with MS, about appointments and helps to explain sign the consent form, etc. And you can also have other members, such as a nurse coordinator, a regulatory coordinator, and other people who help kind of keep the process going. It really depends on how large the research team is. So for instance, at some academic centers, like let's say Harvard or Hopkins or USC, you may have a very large research team with several coordinators. And then at some smaller practices like mine, you may have one research coordinator. So what are the responsibilities of the team, right? So the team on the healthcare side, the responsibilities are obtaining the consent for research. So making sure that whoever is agreeing to participate understands what the goal is, what their responsibilities are, the visits, how often they're scheduled, etc. They also make sure that the site is staying in compliance, right? So that means, you know, when I sign up to do a research study, I can't just go on the site and decide to do what I want to do. I have to stick to that protocol that's been created so that we can make sure all the patients are safe and being treated equally. Also, we have to report any side effects or adverse events. So if someone is at my clinic in a study and they have a problem, we have to report that to the sponsor so that all side effects are kept track of, you know, in the study. And then of course, record keeping and, you know, keeping control of the medication, right? So making sure it's in a safe place where nobody's taking it home or touching it or tampering with it. All right, so what are the role of sponsors? So this is a group we hadn't really talked about. So there are the investigators who work at your neurologist's office or at the academic center. And then you have the sponsors. These are the people that are paying for the trial. Usually these are companies who are invested in this compound or device to try to get it approved. They do help create the protocol in combination with some investigators and other, you know, experts in the field, and hopefully now patients as well. They also are responsible for selecting the investigators and the sites that participate in the trial. So there are only a certain number of sites for each clinical trial. And oftentimes clinical trials are global. So there may be a certain number of sites in the US, a certain number of sites in Europe and in other countries around the world. So these sites are global. So even though 1,000 to 3,000 people seems like a lot of people, when you have sites all over the world, it winds up with maybe 5 or 6 people or 10 from each site participating in a clinical trial. And then also the role of the sponsor is to make sure that the FDA and all of the investigators are made aware of any new side effects or risks that occur with certain medications. All right, so diversity in clinical trials. So if you have seen me present, you've seen me present this slide before, but I think it's really important because it not only applies to minorities and underrepresented ethnic groups, but I think it applies to many of those groups that are not included in our traditional clinical research. So we can think about pediatric populations. We can think about people over the age of 55, because most of our trials up until recent years only went from 18 to 55. Some of the newer ones go to age 65. But again, if you ask me, 65 is young. So I don't think that that's old, but certainly we have many people with MS who are in that age range. And so we need to understand how our therapies affect these populations as well. So essentially, if everybody's not included, we can miss different cultural issues, environmental or other physiologic factors that may happen. And so again, it affects our ability to generalize our findings. So how can we say this applies to everybody when everybody was not included in the original research plan? So a little bit about kind of how MS has changed in the US. Essentially, what we found is that MS occurs in a lot more populations than we previously thought. So MS typically, when I was coming along in training, was described as a young white woman's disease. We now know, at least in the US, that the incidence of MS may be highest in Black women, and the risk may be up to 47% higher in Black women. When we look at the prevalence of MS across the United States, this is a graphic from a paper that was just published in 2022. Well, maybe not just, because now it's 2023, but it was published in 2022. And essentially, it's showing that the prevalence of MS, or the occurrence of MS in the US, is similar between Black and white populations. And the reason, again, this is important is because Black people make up a much lower percentage of the US population than white people, you know. So for a lower number of people to have a similar incidence of disease means the risk is higher in that group that makes up the lower percentage of the population. And I think, again, one of the reasons that I'm very passionate about this work and why, I believe it's important to make sure that people are represented and make sure that we're addressing issues in these populations is because of data like this. So this was a study that was published in 2018 by my good friend, Dr. Liliana Amescua, and essentially shows that Black people die at younger ages from MS. And MS is not generally considered a fatal disease. So when we see a higher percentage of Black people dying in their 20s up to 40s from multiple sclerosis, it definitely is something that needs to be addressed and that we need to be paying attention to and trying to understand why we're seeing these outcomes. Now, what about other populations? So the changing face of MS. Certainly, we know that more Black and Hispanic people have multiple sclerosis than we previously thought, but we're also finding that we have very high percentages of people in the age range of people that have been excluded from most of our clinical trials traditionally. So when we look at the prevalence of MS, so there was a great study published by the MS Society back in 2019, and that was a study that told us that nearly 1 million people in the US have multiple sclerosis. Prior to that study being published, we thought that about half that number had MS. And I jokingly tell my colleagues that, we had a number and every 10 years or so, we would double that number, but we didn't really have good data to help us understand how many people were affected by multiple sclerosis. So when that study came out and we saw that there were nearly 1 million, twice as what we thought, it also gave us some other valuable data. So if you look at this picture, it's looking at the age ranges of people in the US with multiple sclerosis. Now, typically when we talk about MS, we say it's diagnosed between the ages of 20 and 40 or 30 and 50, and many people do start having symptoms around that time. But when you look at the majority of people, the prevalence of MS in certain age groups today, so to speak, even though this is 2019, you can see those really high blue bars in the middle are telling us that people between the ages of 45 and 74 are the highest number of people with MS in the US. So even though we think of it as a young person's disease, the majority of people living with MS now are in their 40s, 50s, and their 60s. So when we think about underserved communities and underrepresented communities, again, we have to be very careful to make sure that we don't make the minority a minority, right? So there are many groups that are underserved. So, I do a lot of work focused on ethnically diverse populations, but certainly people who live in rural populations are often underrepresented in our research. And this affects outcomes. I live in Georgia, and so we always joke, we say there's Atlanta and the rest of Georgia. And so we have many patients that travel 3, 4, and 5 hours to come and see us, right? So these are people who may not be able to participate in research as it is currently conducted. We think, of course, of people of color, people who are low income, those with disabilities, those who may not speak English as a primary language, as well as people who are underinsured or uninsured and have limited education. So all of these underserved communities could potentially have poor outcomes. So we may see higher mortality rates from general diseases, not necessarily MS, more morbidity and mortality, higher medical costs, as well as lower access to treatment and things like health insurance. So, we have to pay attention to all of these communities. And I didn't mention LGBTQ+, but that's listed here as well, to make sure that we're providing equitable care for everyone. So this slide, I also show pretty frequently when doing talks focused on research, but just goes to show that there are many factors that lead to health outcomes aside from just what medication you take, right? So certainly there are different biases within the healthcare system. There can be limited access to resources depending on where you live. There are also systemic barriers, and then underrepresentation in clinical studies, again, affects our ability to look at someone in the clinic and say, this applies to you, but because we don't have the research to really support that. So health disparities, this is just another slide talking about health disparities. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just saying that socioeconomic status can impact health outcomes. Also, systemic racism and discrimination of different groups can affect health outcomes as well. So when we talk about how people do, so to speak, with MS, one of the biggest issues that we don't understand about some of these underrepresented groups are the impact of social determinants of health. That's the things like your insurance, your economic status, your access to health care, etc. How that impacts outcomes versus actual biology, right? So there's not a lot that we understand about biology from underrepresented groups because they're not included in our studies. One of the biggest questions we're asking with, for instance, ethnic minority groups who may have worse outcomes is it related more to, the social determinants of health, access to care, discrimination, or is it biology? We also are asking these same questions about our populations over 55 because we know there are changes that happen to the immune system as we age. So when we see, for instance, worse outcome or more progression, is it more issues with maybe people not being treated equally, or kind of this myth that everyone should stop treatment after a certain age, or is it biology? What are the risks of taking medications after certain ages? There's a lot that we still need to understand, and clinical research helps us to understand these questions. So looking at representation, again, of underrepresented minorities in clinical trials, we can see there are small numbers. So again, even though the prevalence is similar between Black and white people in the US, Black people make up anywhere from 2.3 to 16% of clinical trial populations in our randomized trials for MS. Most of the trials are more on the 2.3% side versus the 15% side, and Hispanic groups anywhere from 7 to 7.5%. Most of our trials are primarily conducted in Eastern Europe. So there certainly was a big issue with the war in Ukraine because there were many trial participants that were lost, and studies had to open up sites, more sites in the US and other parts in the world to compensate for the groups that were lost, lost to follow up in Eastern Europe. So again, we need more representation and more diverse representation. We go back to that slide. And one other thing that I'd like to add is that particularly with some of our populations, we need to understand how treatments affect them over time. And so we need more diversity in the clinical research population that we have. Oh, and I know what I was going to say. When we think about the patterns of treatment, so because most of our trials are conducted in Eastern Europe, many of the patients who are in trials maybe have never been on medication before. And the physicians and healthcare systems practice differently than we do here in the US. So, when we have someone or a trial that's conducted in people who've never been on medicine, and then we use that same medicine in people who have been on 2 or 3 or 4 different medicines, the effects may be different, right? So again, representation not only in different groups, but more representation in different parts of the world as well. So the role of participants, right? So participants in clinical research do have some responsibilities. So one of them is to provide an accurate medical history, right? To make sure there are not things that will interfere with the study medication or put you at risk for side effects. To talk about the protocol, make sure you understand, to come to visits that are part of the protocol, and to let the staff know if you have side effects or issues. And again, this is not just for clinical trials, this is for any type of research that you participate in. And so, when we think about research, obviously we have underrepresentation of some groups. This is a really interesting slide from some work I did with the Minority Research Partnership Network. And we just kind of looked at what are some of the barriers to people being involved in research, and what are some of the things that facilitate or get people excited about being involved in research. So certainly some of the barriers, which are huge barriers, are lack of awareness, right? So many times, if someone does not get treated for their MS at a large academic center or at a large private practice that conducts research, people don't know where to find out about studies, whether they are registries, clinical trials, or other types of interventional studies. Sometimes people don't understand the consent, which they can often be 20-page documents with lots and lots of small writing. So that certainly can be a barrier. Concern for safety, which is valid. Sometimes there's lack of trust. Also, different competing demands for your cost, for your time. People have to work, and sometimes you have to take time off to participate. So there are a lot of reasons that are things that may be barriers. Some of the things that facilitate is altruism. So some people want to help further information in the MS community. Certainly, some trials are easier to enroll if a medication is already on the market and has been proven versus something that may be new. And then, of course, less invasive options are often reasons people want to be involved in research. So again, when we think about barriers, so kind of just going back and looking at it bit by bit. So one of the big issues may be health provider bias. So some principal investigators or study coordinators or principal investigators may assume that someone doesn't want to be involved and so doesn't ask them. So that's a big barrier, right? So people not knowing where to find out about research, or if they're a part of a research institution, not being asked to participate, right? In other cases, there may be restrictive inclusion and exclusion criteria. So these are the criteria that say who can be in the study, who can't be in the study. Again, age, right? So most of our earlier trials up to 55, some of the newer ones up to 65, but many people are pushing to see if we can push that age up for some of our trials, because we have people with MS who are of a variety of ages. And then also the in-person time commitment. So many of the trials are conducted with multiple visits. You got to go to the doctor. You may have to sit there all day, and it can be expensive if you have a job or if you have other duties and responsibilities. And so it's difficult to have people take that time away from their daily life to participate. Other things, lack of diverse researchers. So some people, feel more comfortable if the researcher, they can identify with the researcher or members of the staff. So that's an issue. And then also the questions that are asked are determined by who's in charge of the research. Also the areas where people are recruited. Again, we're missing out on rural patients. There are many different groups that are trying to find ways to connect some of our large centers to maybe smaller practices, so that other people can be involved and don't have to travel 4 or 5 hours to be involved in research. And then barriers that are common for Black and Hispanic patients. I think we've covered most of these. Not asked to participate, lack of awareness. Okay, the trial may be too far away. There also may be issues with socioeconomic status and just the financial burden of being involved. And then we talked a little bit about inclusion and exclusion criteria. So in some cases that may apply to age, but for instance, in certain minority groups, there may be a higher risk of comorbidities, things like diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney disease. And if the criteria is very, very restrictive, then many groups may automatically be excluded from clinical research because they have these other conditions. All right, so mistrust, I won't spend a lot of time on that, but this is an excellent book, Medical Apartheid, that talks about kind of the history of research, particularly in the African American community. And so it's important and very imperative on us as healthcare providers to make sure that we establish trust with our patients, because there are many things that have occurred historically, as well as current things that happen where people may feel like they aren't heard or they're dismissed, and may affect the way they interact with the healthcare system. But there's hope. So I'll talk about a couple projects I'm very excited about in the next few slides, as well as some work that's being done to try to increase diversity in clinical research as a whole. All right, so this was a paper, a very, very long paper. It's 440 pages, published by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, but really talking about the importance of building research equity for women and underrepresented groups, right? So again, underrepresented groups include a variety of people, including ethnic minority groups, LGBTQ+ community, elderly populations, as well as women who are pregnant. That's an area where we really don't have a lot of research, and where now many people are doing research, particularly in MS, to try to understand, so that we don't just stop treatment in everybody and say, let's see what happens after you have a baby. So this was a great paper that gave many recommendations to try to improve outcomes in these groups, and really to try to give a sense of urgency to the scientific community that we can't just keep doing things the same way, that we have to begin to include different people so that everyone's represented in research. This was a paper I was very fortunate to collaborate on, and I'm not going to read every one of those little lines on there, but basically the point was to say that this problem with underrepresentation in research and the need to increase diversity is something that is it will take multiple levels to approach, right? I think one of the things that I try to stress when we talk about low participation is to make sure that we don't put the onus on the participant, because really everyone that participates in research is a volunteer. You're volunteering your time, you're volunteering often your blood samples and other things, so we have to make it as easy and accessible as possible for people to participate, as well as making sure we're doing that safely. So we have to look at things from the patient level, we have to look at the system where we're doing the trials, and then we also have to look at the studies and make sure that we're employing things like telemedicine and other technologies to make trials more accessible. If there's anything I've learned from our, from going through the COVID-19 pandemic, is that a lot of things that we thought we had to do in person, we absolutely do not have to do in person. And so I think we have to begin to renovate the way that we're conducting research to apply those strategies. I think another important piece about research is building community partnerships, making sure that, scientific centers and sponsors are reaching out to the community, not just to say be in my trial, but to really help the community, right? To not only raise awareness about opportunities, but also to look at ways to invest in the community, whether it's through different outreach programs or other things, and make sure that once a trial is finished, that they don't disappear, but that they continue to be invested in the community and build and foster good relationships. This was a paper issued by the FDA to discuss increasing diversity in clinical trials, and just gave some recommendations to broaden criteria, decrease the burdensome parts of the trials, and create inclusive enrollment and retention processes. And I'll give a couple of examples. The CHIMES trial, which I'm very, very proud of, is the first clinical trial focused on Black and Hispanic people with multiple sclerosis. And we designed this trial in collaboration with scientific investigators, in collaboration with members from advocacy groups such as the Accelerated Cure Project, as well as the MSAA. And also we had patients involved. And so I was very excited about the way that we really had a multidisciplinary approach to creating the protocol for this trial and making sure that we included the patient voice. And well, I guess back to CHIMES, I thought I had one more slide on CHIMES, but I'm very proud to say that because of those efforts, we enrolled ahead of time, and we over-enrolled for the trial by 25% in a group that people say don't want to be involved in trials. The National African American MS Registry, I'm also very proud of, is an effort to try to understand MS in the Black population. And myself and several of my colleagues helped found this registry, which is a questionnaire. It doesn't involve any blood or samples or anything like that. People can just go to the website there and fill out the questionnaire so that we can understand some of the risk factors for MS and how people are being treated across the US. And then, I think it's also important to include resources where people can go to find out about research, to see if there's research being conducted in your area. Clinicaltrials.gov is the primary site where most research is listed. It's a little hard to navigate, though, even for me as a doctor to read. It's a hard read, but certainly to find out if there are things in your area. That's a broad site. Researchmatch.org is a site where people can go and type in their condition and look to see if there are studies conducted in the area. Also, CISCRIP is an organization that's trying to, educate about research and also increase diversity in clinical trials. And then I also have this listed here from the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, a pamphlet where they're trying to get more people involved in research and just kind of giving general education about clinical research. Questions to think about if you're interested in participating in any study, questionnaire, registry, exercise, mindfulness, whatever diet study. I'm not going to read all of these, but these are questions that you can ask, to make sure that you understand what's going on before you sign a consent form. What's the purpose? Who's going to be in the study? What kinds of tests and treatments? Do I have to go to the hospital? How long does it last? So these are all great questions, to think about if someone gives you information about participating in some type of study or clinical trial. These are certain websites where people can find out more about research, and I'll make sure Stuart has these if anyone is interested. And some of these are videos that include patient perspectives about people who are involved in research. What should you expect as a research participant? And then there also are videos about kind of the way trials are set up to make sure that people are safe and that they're doing things, ethically in clinical research. Education and support. I always like to offer resources. So there are many resources for people living with MS to learn more about clinical research and about MS in general. We certainly have MS Views and News listed here. I have a podcast called Brain Chat with the Nerdy Neurologist. We have our registry listed here. And then, of course, there are other organizations. Accelerated Cure Project is a patient-powered research organization that tries to answer questions that are relevant to people living with MS. So they basically take the input of people living with this condition to try to understand what questions to ask of the research community. And I've done a lot of work with them, as well as MS Views and News and We Are Ill, which is an organization for Black women with MS. All right, so what is the path forward? So certainly there are lots of things that need to be done, but certainly some of them are making sure we educate about the benefits of research. I'm a big proponent of self-advocacy for people living with MS and their care partners. Make sure that we're reaching out to the advocacy community to raise awareness about research, diversifying researchers, and then also raising awareness in the medical community about making sure that we're creating trials that are inclusive of these groups that have traditionally been excluded from clinical research. This is where you can find me. I'm the Nerdy Neurologist. I also told Stuart I just published a new book called You Can Live Well with MS, your guidebook to navigating MS diagnosis. And that is available on Amazon. If you're so inclined to check it out. I talk a lot about wellness practices and what people can do to help themselves, because I think that's extremely important. And always my last slide is, all I need is peace, love, and a freaking cure for multiple sclerosis. I hope I did not go over my time. And Stuart, feel free to come back so we can answer any questions that people have. Thank you guys so much for your time and attention on this Thursday night. And hopefully people learn something from what we discussed.
All right, we have questions.
Let's go.
We do. All right. So firstly, what is available for the Native American population?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So I do know of some researchers in the Las Vegas, Nevada area who are working to try to conduct research or to raise awareness about research in the Native American population. It has been kind of traditionally difficult to gain access to like the reservations and to talk to people about research, but I do know a couple of people from that background that are working on that. We have very little to no data in the Native American population, and that absolutely needs to change. So there are many of us that are trying to increase efforts to, gain access and to at least talk to people about the trials that are being conducted.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And another one was, what is being done for the Asian population in the United States?
So again, many of the clinical research trials if you think the numbers for Black and Hispanic groups are very small, for Asian and Pacific Islander, they're also very small, particularly in the US. Now, there isn't as much MS in Asia, so to speak, proper, but when we look at most of our global trials, if we're talking about Asian and Pacific Islander populations, they're mostly from Japan and from China. So very small numbers here in the US. Again, I know some great advocates like Dr. Bob Shin, Dr. Lily Henson, who are trying to focus on increasing the participation in research and understanding the populations. But honestly, for most of our trials, the numbers are so small. If you're talking 2 or 3 people, it's hard to make generalizations about 2 or 3 people involved in the trials.
Thank you for that. Hey, before I go on with questions, I do want to greatly thank you for being online tonight. I mean, that conversation, that dialogue, this discussion was fabulous, and I wish we had more time to hear even more about it. But you really laid out the groundwork, and I can't wait to listen to it again. Okay, seriously.
Absolutely.
All
Absolutely.
right. All right. So going forward, a person named Melissa asked, I want to join a clinical trial, but I'm never accepted. I'm 61, have PPMS and an EDSS of 6.5. I've had MS for 7 years. Why don't they let me join?
Yeah, so again, one of the big barriers is inclusion and exclusion criteria. When we're talking about clinical trials, particularly for medications, there are certain things that have to be measured for them to be effective. The EDSS scale, which is the best scale that we have, to measure disability, really falls short in a lot of ways because it's very heavily weighted on walking. So when someone has a 6, it becomes kind of that magic cutoff for clinical trials where they say you can't be involved, just like that age 55. So somehow that 6 and 55 is a hard no. And particularly with the EDSS, the reason is because in order to measure improvement, or to measure that someone's not getting worse, you have to be able to show or demonstrate that there is stability or improvement in that EDSS score. And once you reach a 6, a lot of times there's not a lot of movement after 6, versus if you have a 4, we can see you either go to 6 or maybe go back to 3. But once you reach that 6, it's considered significant disability. And so oftentimes it's hard for them to measure what is stability and what's improvement from that. So that's the major reason. I think that there are definitely some ways that we can potentially get around that, but it's really because of the limitations of EDSS. Like we need, there are a lot of researchers that are now using more quality of life scales, more other types of functional scales that are not heavily weighted on walking, but it's going to take a little while for those to really get into circulation and replace the EDSS.
Okay, thank you for that. And the next one is from Angela, and Angela is asking, are there any trials in progress for those of us with comorbidities or for any with multiple comorbidities?
Yeah, so there is a push to try to relax some of those criteria. Again, when we're doing a clinical research study, we want to make sure that whatever the intervention is, whether it's a medication or a procedure, is what actually is causing either more damage or stability and improvement. The problem with comorbidities, particularly things like diabetes, high blood pressure, is that sometimes those conditions, if they're uncontrolled, can cause lesions or spots in the brain. And so when we're trying to assess the spots that are from MS and from other things, it can make it more difficult. There is a move for many of us to try to relax some of that criteria. So for instance, with the CHIMES trial, we looked at criteria and tried to relax it as much as possible to allow for people with those comorbidities, as long as they're well controlled, to participate in the research studies. That is something that many of us are pushing for, again, with many of our clinical trial sponsors, but I think it's going to take a little time for that to trickle down. Do I know of studies that are specifically looking at comorbidities? I do not. But my good friend, Dr. Ellen Mulry, who is at Hopkins, and Dr. Ruth Ann Mary, who is in Canada, they have done some studies looking at comorbidities with multiple sclerosis. So I suspect we will be seeing that more and more.
Okay, thank you. All right. Excuse me. Several people, before I get into the medical stuff, several people are asking how they get your book again and what is it called?
Yes, so my book is called You Can Live Well with MS, and it is on Amazon. So you can order it on Amazon. It's a Kindle ebook as well as a hardback. I have not recorded the audiobook yet, but probably next month, after things slow down a little bit, I'll go in the studio and record the audiobook, and then the audiobook will be available on Audible.
Next, what do people do if they want to get involved with a trial, but they're really not sure how they're going to get there, especially like you mentioned rural America. So what about those that are in rural America that may not have proper transportation to get to the big city? What do they do?
So that's an excellent question. So number one question is to ask the neurologist at the center. There are trials, many of them will provide for transportation, I'm not sure how far, there also are sometimes resources with groups like MSAA that can provide for transportation to doctor's visits. But I would ask the clinical research coordinator. Oftentimes they will have an allowance for travel, and that should allow you to get to and from the study site. And there are also pushes, particularly by myself and many other investigators, to try and reimburse people for some of their time. Your time is also valuable. In the past, that's been looked at as some type of enticement to be in research, but obviously nobody's paying you a whole salary. But your time is valuable. So many of us are looking to cover transportation. We want the sponsors to cover things like childcare costs or elderly care costs if you have to be away from people that you're helping to care for. And then we also are really pushing for people to be paid a stipend for their time.
Great, thank you. All right, next, before I get into the other questions, Elisa is saying, this is one of the best webinars I've ever seen. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to say thank you.
I'm always scared when I talk about research that people will find it boring and go to sleep, but I'm really surprised that people will find it really interesting. So I appreciate that.
There's a lot of people online. I mean, it's been going up and down, but I'm sure that when we get this out on social media after we get it published, I'm sure a lot of people are going to have questions, and they might hit me up to get back with you and see what else there is available. Okay.
Happy to.
Another person wrote, Stephanie wrote, love the research, Dr. Williams. Thank you. All right. Absolutely. So, and here's another person asking about the book. So for everybody that's asking about the book and can't remember to write it down, you will see it when we publish this online. Okay, absolutely. Great. Now you're going to have to look at it online. Yeah, now they're going to have to look online. All right. Next question, nutrition. Are there great amount of studies out there for nutrition and what they're actually doing for MS?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So there are more studies that are looking at nutrition. As you know, Dr. Terry Walls does a lot of work with nutrition. So she's got several studies that are going. There are also some other researchers that are looking at different diets and how they affect MS. One of the difficulties with nutrition studies is that basically is getting them paid for, right? So if you have a study that has something like a medication or some type of intervention, it's easier to find a sponsor to pay for that than it is for someone to pay for, nutritional studies. So there are several studies that I know of that have been looked at and kind of assess different diets. I know Terry does a lot of work in that regard. But I don't know of any large clinical trials, multi-site trials that are looking at research. I know there are several that are starting to look at exercise. So that's a really hot topic. Many of my colleagues, I've had conversations with folks that exercise is the disease modifier that people don't use enough. So there is a lot more push toward exercise. Diet is getting there, but it's not quite there like exercise is.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right, next, what's the deal on giving blood?
What's the deal on giving blood? Yes.
The Red Cross will not take blood from a person with multiple sclerosis. What's the deal with that?
No. So I don't know. There are a lot of kind of ideas about certain things that I think have not been proven. So for instance, the idea about live vaccines, right? It's typically recommended that people with MS don't receive live vaccines because we're concerned something may happen, but there's not data to support that. And my patients who need live vaccines get live vaccines. Now, I'm not saying get live vaccines, but I think it's very similar with giving blood. Now in the past, it may have been a concern because people used to receive whole blood, where if, for instance, you had antibodies, we still don't know a lot about the cause of MS. There may have been concern that maybe those antibodies would be passed on. But now that blood products are usually broken down into parts, they basically take your blood that you give and separate it into little pieces. You got plasma over here and platelets over here and fresh frozen plasma. I don't know that the risk is that severe, but I honestly don't think anybody's gone back to really look and to understand, if there really is any type of risk associated with it. Okay, so I think it's laziness on the scientific community. They're just like, we don't want to be bothered looking at it. That's right.
That's right. Thank you for that. Virginia's got a statement. I'm going to say that in a minute. But first, I'm going to say, Virginia, we need your help. We're coming to Savannah in a few weeks, and I need your help. So listen, I'm going to be calling you soon, okay? So Virginia writes, I love this awareness of clinical trials research. Thank you, Dr. Williams. All right, and Kevin is asking, I want to ask about aging out of clinical trials, but you answered it already. At 63, there aren't many trials accepting us that I know of about. I have completed 2 trials when I was younger. So Kevin writes that, but before you answer that, I want to ask one thing. We hear about too old for clinical trials. What is too young?
18, under 18, 17.
Gotcha.
So the 2 big populations age-wise are excluded are pediatric populations and people over the age of 55 to 65. Most trials are moving to 65 instead of 55, but the majority of our early trials for our 20+ drugs only went to age 55. Again, I think it is because of, in many cases, theoretical concerns. I think there's a lot that we don't understand about what happens to our immune system as we age, and I think that, as a scientist, one of the things that I try to impress upon my colleagues is that we either experiment in the trials or we experiment on people in real life. Because if they're not in the trials, when I get in the clinic and these people need the medicine, it's almost like we're experimenting on them, to see what happens. Whereas we had done the research beforehand, at least we have some idea. There is a large clinical trial that's looking at, older populations over 55. But that trial is really looking to see if we should stop medication in those groups. So I'm not sure what other measures they're looking at to try to understand the immune system. But I'm hopeful that once that trial is completed, we'll at least have some better understanding about the risks with our medicines as we age and how those affect the immune system.
Okay, thank you for that. And then what do we have? We had a couple things. Oh, yeah. So somebody was asking me, are there any clinical trials out there for medications for symptom management meds?
So not many. Again, the issue is basically when you do a clinical research study, somebody's got to pay for it, right? So you got to get people involved. You got to pay for, whatever the medication is, for transportation, all of those things. And so many of our symptomatic managements are generic. And so those companies are not going to pay for a study for something that's already proved that people are using anyway. So there are groups that are getting funding from like our societies, et cetera, to conduct some of these studies. But I don't know a lot of research that's being conducted with symptomatic management at this time.
Okay, thank you for that. And the last one that I have for you is that a person is in the military and has been told that he or she, I'm not going to designate, has not been permitted to undergo any clinical trial for things that they might have ingested. What's the deal with that?
I don't know. So I'm not sure. Now the VA has its own whole thing going on over here, aside from, a lot of our other major research centers. I can say I've had in my career many patients from the military. I've done work at the VA who've been concerned about different things they've been exposed to and if they could have caused their MS or their other chronic neurologic conditions. The honest answer is that we don't know. And so, I'm not sure why that regulation exists.
Okay, thank you for that. Somebody just wrote me, maybe Agent Orange has something to do with it.
I was going to say, I'm not going to say it, but that's one of the ones that I've heard frequently. So I've heard that frequently.
Right. All right. Well, thank you for that. Now, one last thing. I keep saying one last thing, but somebody keeps writing in. This person would like to know if you ever heard of the relief band for nausea.
I have not. I have not heard that, but I will go look it up once I leave this webinar.
That's right. And I want to know when you are going to undertake a study for people over 55.
Hey, I'm working on it. So as soon as we get our new space, we'll have our research department up and running. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great, great. So I'm out of questions, except that you know that I always have questions, but I'll hit you up another time with some of those. As far as tonight's program, though, we are out of questions, and I just want to thank everybody for being online tonight with us. All right, and Dr. Williams, you know that I'm going to call on you a lot, and I hope you'll always be able to answer and be there, and the world would not be a happy place without you. So keep on doing what you do for us.
Thank you, guys. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and thank you for having me, Stuart.
Bye-bye.